with that, we'd like to start with a bit of introduction. So if you could tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, definitely. So my name is Lauren. I am from Chantilly, Virginia. I'm 29 years old. I was diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder when I was 9 years old. Throughout the years, I was then diagnosed with PTSD, major depressive disorder, and ADHD along with asthma. So most of my life has been me being a very anxious child. My parents took me to all sorts of doctors because they couldn't figure out what was wrong with me. I also grew up in a household that was, broken. It was a broken household. My father is an alcoholic. So growing up in a household like that at such a young age really had a big impact on my life. And I think it triggered my anxiety and depression even further. It does run in my family. It's hereditary, and it was never stigmatized in my life, which was really great. But me dealing with all these problems, I went to so many doctors as a child. They could never figure out what was wrong with me. They finally took me to a psychiatrist who had diagnosed me with generalized anxiety disorder. From there, they had decided to put me on prozac, and that changed everything for me. It flipped a switch, and I felt like I was a normal person again. It was really wonderful. Over the years, things got worse with my dad. And I went into a really big depression, actually at age 13, where I had attempted suicide, and I was placed on more medication. So over the life, I've been on so many different medications for so many different illnesses, which has been really interesting and tough because those things have side effects, and I've dealt with all the side effects, and I've been on so many different medications over the years. And back when I was a 9-year-old child, anxiety was not really a thing you talked about. Because I was diagnosed in the early, either late 90s or early 2000s, where anxiety just wasn't a thing. So it was really tough dealing with that. On top of that, I got sick all the time as a child. I was always sick. I always got bronchitis. I always had some sort of weird cough. And I always failed in gym class. And so when I was in gym class, I failed a lot of we had to do a 1 mile run, and they would fail me on it, but I couldn't do it. And no one ever thought to think maybe she has another problem, but they just thought I was faking it and it wasn't real. And that's how the school nurse was as well. She always thought I was faking my stomach aches and it wasn't real. So that was really tough for me to deal with. I actually wasn't even diagnosed with asthma until I was 21 years old. I had been in the hospital so many times for asthma, but I didn't know it was asthma at the time. I always went in for bronchitis, and I get to the point where I literally couldn't breathe. They would put me on different nebulizers with either a steroid, then they would put me on albuterol, but they never thought to think it was ever asthma. So I was going to, the urgent care probably once every 2 months. I'd be in urgent care, couldn't breathe, and it was really bad. So finally, when I went into the hospital one time, I had to go in the ER because I literally could not breathe and I kept coughing. They said, "That sounds like an asthma cough." And I was like, "I've never been diagnosed with asthma." So they referred me to a pulmonologist where I went in and got a test done. It's a pulmonary function test, and I failed it. So I had asthma. For them, then on, they put me on different steroid inhalers along with inhalers to kind of boost it. So I've been on probably 10 different types of inhalers till they got 2 for me that actually worked, along with my own nebulizer. And anytime I get sick, I get deathly sick. I do not function well, and I have to usually either go to the ER, but now I go to the pulmonologist, and they usually put me on. First, they give me a shot of steroids, and then they give me a taper of prednisone, which is a steroid, an oral steroid. So every time I get sick, it's always been really, really tough for me and really rough to deal with.
Sure. So Lauren, thank you so much. And certainly you nicely and very quickly went through quite a bit. And so one of the things I like to do is step through a bit more slowly, because there's a lot of sort of detail in the experience that will help others as they reflect on their own journeys. One of the things that I did want to ask about is sort of with the diagnosis of generalized anxiety disorder, what did that feel like for you to have the anxiety, and when was it to the point that you realized that it wasn't a quote unquote typical anxiety, but it was a condition that needed needed attention. And who was it that helped you to come to that realization? Did your mom help you realize that this was more? And then you went to the doctor? How did that work?
So what had happened is I would get, my stomach it would hurt to the point where I could not move. I literally was like immobilized and I couldn't move. And I would have, it's kind of gross, but diarrhea like every single day. And I had a really low weight. I was always severely underweight anytime I went to a doctor. And these stomach aches were like so painful that I would just cry and freak out and just like sit in a fetal position on the ground and keep crying and have these stomach aches. And it started a lot with actually having anxiety over sleep. I didn't know what anxiety was at that time, but I couldn't go to sleep at night. I'd be freaked out if everyone was asleep before I was, and that would make me really wound up, and it would make my stomach hurt even worse. So I just couldn't sleep, and I didn't sleep. So I would just stay up all night trying to sleep and freaking out and not being able to sleep. And the stomach aches just continued to get worse, and I continued to not to be able to go out in big crowds of people. So anytime we went on like a trip somewhere and my stomach hurt, they would have to stop over at a bathroom immediately. And the bathroom was my calming place. I would go there and I would feel relaxed there. But I was around like crowds of people, there was a lot going on. Or if it was something that like I had to do, it would give me that awful feeling of like impending doom almost. And my stomach would just hurt so bad that I would just keep crying. So they thought I might have like GI problems. They took me to like a gastroenterologist who checked me out and said that I was completely fine. And they said that I might have anxiety. And my parents weren't too surprised because both of them were also diagnosed with anxiety. So from there, they had taken me to a psychiatrist who had diagnosed me with anxiety. And it was a relief for me to feel like I had a diagnosis finally, because I never know what was wrong with me. I kept thinking something's wrong with me, that I'm never going to figure out what it is. Why am I feeling this way? Why is it so awful? So having that diagnosis really helped me, but I wouldn't tell people about it because it was stigmatized, especially at such a young age to be diagnosed with something like that. I didn't really talk about it, but that's when I was put on the Prozac by a psychiatrist who I did not really like. I thought he was kind of like he wasn't a very nice man, but the Prozac really, really helped me. It took weeks to work, but once it was there, it helped me. My anxiety had like dissipated a lot, and I was able to like manage and do things and not freak out about sleep.
That's great. And between the time where you initially saw or initially had sort of the inclination to go to the GI doctor and then finally went to the psychiatrist and finally received the Prozac, how long would you say that process took?
I would say, because I think my family had taken me to like my primary care doctor first about it, who then said I should go to a GI doctor. I feel like the whole process probably took like 2 to 3 months to get to the point where I was actually seen by a psychiatrist, because my parents didn't want to put me on medication at such a young age because it can have really bad side effects, and they didn't know what the long-term side effects would be on Prozac for like a child's at that point in time. But they had made the right call, in my opinion, to put me on Prozac.
Great. And after the Prozac, if you could compare it before and after, what were you now able to do because of the appropriate medication?
So I was able to go out in like large groups and crowds of areas. I lived very close to Washington, D.C. So I was able to go into D.C. and like be able to go to museums, be able to go to zoos, be able to do like normal outdoor activities that I loved to do as a child, be able to go to sleepovers again. So I was having issues with going over my friends' houses for sleepovers because my stomach would get turned up into knots, and I would be freaked out that everyone would, go to sleep before I did.
And you mentioned PTSD. So when did you realize that there was more than the anxiety, and how did that manifest? And could you determine what might have caused it?
Definitely. So the PTSD was diagnosed much later in my life. I want to say it was like actually diagnosed probably like a couple of years ago. I had some traumatic experiences with my dad, where once he attempted to kill my mom, and the other time he had taken me in his car when he was drunk and essentially kidnapped me for a couple of hours, even though my mom was yelling at him not to take me away because he was drunk. So I feel like I didn't realize I had PTSD until later on in life when things started to trigger me. And when the things started to trigger me, I was diagnosed with the PTSD, where I would just get extreme breakdowns and have panic attacks again.
Sure. And so those instances, so first, sorry that you experienced those things. how old were you when those things happened?
So those were between the ages of like 9 and 11. So it was just very early on in my development. But as a child of that age, I thought it was like my responsibility to help my dad. And, I was strong and I could do this and I was going to be okay. And later on in life, I realized that's kind of messed up. My parents put me in a lot of situations that were not great or acceptable. And just seeing that now, being like an adult, has kind of changed my view on them as parents.
And would you say that a part of, your father's challenges with alcohol might be related to some of his psychological challenges as well? You mentioned he has been diagnosed with anxiety.
Yep.
Do you think that might be sort of the alcohol might be self-medication of some sort?
Yeah, so he did self-medicate. My mom's mother died when I was 5 years old. And that's when my dad started drinking. My mom went into a really, really deep depression where she just wouldn't get out of bed at all. She wouldn't do anything. And my dad couldn't help her and didn't know how to help her. And that's when he started drinking heavily. And he was also mixing it with his anti-anxiety medication, which is very dangerous and deadly to do because he was on Klonopin. And mixing that with alcohol can cause brain damage. So he has told me it was caused by my mom's death, my grandmother's death, and he didn't know how to help her.
So that's more recent. And in the meantime, so I'm presuming this is high school where you're going to PE and you're not able to complete all the different.
Yeah. So and go ahead. Sorry.
How many different episodes of asthma attacks did you experience before getting the formal diagnosis?
I feel like I experienced them from honestly elementary school. Even elementary school, I couldn't complete the mile. I couldn't run the entire way. It would hurt. My lungs would literally be on fire and hurt. So I would generally either start fast walking or start walking because it hurt so bad. And that continued on through middle school and through high school. And in high school, it's also graded. So I got poor grades in gym when I literally tried as hard as I could and I just couldn't do it. And I hated gym for that reason. It made me really despise it because I was never very good at sports, especially anything to do with running. It would just hurt my lungs really bad.
And you mentioned you were going to the hospital every couple of months for that was bronchitis.
Mm-hmm.
Why do you think that it took so long? Because every couple of months seeing a doctor, were they not listening? Were they not looking out for it? What were the challenges there?
So the challenges there were they would ask me if I was already diagnosed with asthma. And when I said I was not diagnosed with asthma, they would shove it off as being she does not have asthma. Therefore, she does not have asthma, which does not make sense to me now. But in the meantime, I did. I just thought I got bronchitis all the time because asthma presents itself in a lot of ways. And the way it presents itself in me is I cough a lot. And it's known as an asthma cough. And I didn't know what an asthma cough was. I thought asthma was just your lungs getting really tight and you can't breathe. But I was coughing all the time, so I didn't attribute it to asthma because I was not knowledgeable in what asthma actually was.
Yeah, and that's news to me as well, that there is such a thing as an asthma cough. Is it different from a normal cough in some ways? It maybe harsher, perhaps?
It is. It's harsher. Sometimes it presents itself with wheezing. Sometimes it's just more dry kind of a cough. It's kind of hard to explain. I had never heard of what an asthma cough was before until I had gone to the ER one time and they were like, this sounds like an asthma cough. And I was like, that's weird.
Yeah, I mean, and you'd never heard about it, and I've never heard about it. And so I imagine many folks, think that it's maybe something transient, right? It's triggered by an allergen or something.
Exactly. Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned that because they did take me to an allergist. In the meantime, they had thought my cough was allergy. So they had put me on a medication, Singular, that I was on for 10 years. And I finally, when I went to my pulmonologist, he sent me to an allergist to see what allergies I had. And I had no allergies. So my asthma was not triggered by allergies.
And so, part of that challenging situation is you were experiencing this. As you were explaining it, it was either not interpreted correctly or passed off as something else. And it was treated as episodic, as something that would disappear, except you were continuously going back every couple of months. So that should have triggered someone to ask deeper questions.
Exactly. Yeah, you would think so, especially in an area that I was in. I was in a metropolitan area, like the suburbs of DC, where there's a lot of doctors, and it's not like I'm in a small country town. It's like I'm in a big town with lots of doctors. You think one of them would like question the issues like going on, but no one ever did.
So you went more than a decade experiencing these issues.
Yeah.
Inability to function from an exercise and physical perspective. What you thought was the bronchitis every few months, and so that's I would argue a system failure that didn't serve you appropriately.
Yeah,
When you finally got your pulmonary function test, did they tell you sort of how severe it was, and had it been caught earlier, would it have been less severe?
So they said it was considered moderate to severe, but they did not talk about me being diagnosed earlier, but I had told them that I was never diagnosed. I also had no idea what a tight chest actually was. Throughout my entire life as a child, when I was doing anything like physical, I would have a tightness in my chest, but I didn't know there was a name for that. It's always what I felt. So it was like a constant thing. So I thought that was normal. When they had given me albuterol, which opens up like your lungs, I realized what a tight chest actually was, and I had experienced that throughout my entire life.
And for those who may not know, could you describe what it feels like and how you know it's different from what you would normally feel?
Sure. So it's kind of like your chest is going up inside of a tiny little ball, and it feels like it's constricting you. Like right here, it just feels like you're being constricted almost, and that you're kind of breathing out of a straw is the best way to describe it.
And do you feel like getting air into the lungs is more difficult? Is that part of it as well?
It is, yeah. It feels like you can't take deep breaths of like air. It feels like you're trying to, but you just can't do it.
And is that what causes the wheezing?
Yeah, I think that's what causes the wheezing. I don't always present wheezing. A lot of times I only present wheezing when I'm like actually sick. I get viral infections a lot, which triggers my asthma and usually causes me to get bronchitis.
So we're going back and forth a bit, I recognize, and because there's multiple things, but going back to PTSD and depression and those kinds of things, between your first diagnosis with GAD at a very young age, and it sounds like you got the treatment for that relatively quickly, which is great, but many, many, many years until the PTSD diagnosis. Once that happened, what were the new treatments that were tried, and did they help with PTSD?
So throughout the years, I have been on like a slew of so many different anti-anxiety or anti-depression medications to see what would work for my depression and anxiety. My husband and I had wanted to try for a kid, and I had heard that being on some of these medications could be either fatal for a fetus or have like complications. So I wanted to go off of the medications that I was on. When I did that, everything went down to a really dark hole, and it was really, really tough for me, and I couldn't function as a human being. And that's how I felt when I was 9 years old. I just couldn't function as a human being. So it took me until, like I said, pretty recently to be diagnosed with the PTSD, where I realized that things really do trigger me, and things really do upset me or anger me or freak me out or set me off that I didn't even know about before, just because I attributed to me being a strong child who could handle all of this.
So what are some of those things that are triggers for you?
So a lot of the triggers are either things like people that are yelling, people that are kind of heated arguments, being told, I guess, I'm doing something even wrong triggers me back to my father. He was very mentally abusive. So it's certain things that people will say to me, that my dad would say to me, that just freaks me out and kind of makes me go into a little like shell almost, where I just don't want to talk and don't want to function. So it's like it's certain situations when I'm talking with people, especially, or if I'm with people who are like arguing with each other or either arguing with me or raising their voice, that really freaks me out.
And is it critical, like sort of folks being critical of you? Is that part of it or not?
That can be part of it. If someone's being like critical to me, a lot of times I take it way too personally, which is something I have been working on. But it was like as a child, everything was my fault. So if something happens, even if it was out of my control and it wasn't my fault, I go back into that feeling of that's my fault, even if it wasn't. And even if the person's not directing it at me, I just get this like all this guilt. I hold a lot of guilt for everything. And I still hold guilt for things that I'm not responsible for.
And that's, you sound very wise as you're talking about what clearly is a very big part of your life. Where have you collected this wisdom? Is it through formal therapy? Is it through reading things? Where do you get this information to be able to share it?
Well, first of all, thank you very much. I really appreciate that. It's a really amazing compliment. I've been going to therapy since I was 9 years old. So my parents put me straight into therapy. Even when my dad was going through his being an alcoholic, he tried to get help too. He got help multiple times and was clean for 13 years and then relapsed. But for me, therapy helped me so much. I had the same therapist from age 9 to age 21. So therapy helped me with coping skills. It helped me how to deal with things and not feel ashamed and not feel guilty, and talking things out helped me so much. And I was also given homework on little things to work on, which was really amazing. I have since moved from Virginia and I have a new therapist, and he does CBD therapy, which has been really, really helpful for me for labeling my thoughts and labeling how I feel as just like, that's just a thought. That's not who you are. You're just thinking things, which has really helped me, and journaling as well. Anytime I feel extra overwhelmed, I write all of my feelings out, and it really helps me.
So you had mentioned some of the coping mechanisms from your first therapist. What were some of those that were provided?
So with my first therapist, when I was a child, we would just kind of like play. She would have like a dollhouse out, and we would just kind of play together and talk. And I would just talk about things, how I felt. And she would ask me questions on how does this make you feel, which made me feel less alone. I'm an only child, so I didn't really have a sibling to talk to or to like share the trauma with. And I didn't know what trauma was. I was diagnosed with having traumatic disorder. So she would just talk to me and let me explain how I feel, and being able to explain how I feel. And she would tell me, this is probably why you feel this way, really helped me grow and learn.
That's wonderful that you had the support that you needed to talk things through. Someone who wasn't day-to-day, every day involved in your life. So it was a safe place for you to be able to share. That's wonderful. It's wonderful. And you mentioned with the second therapist, could you explain to folks the process of CBD?
Sure. So CBT is cognitive behavioral therapy, and it's kind of just rewiring almost how you think and labeling your thoughts. So if you're thinking a thought, like a negative thought about yourself, you label this thought as, this was just a thought. This is just what I was thinking. This does not define who I am. And being able to recognize what you're thinking, why you're thinking that way, and to label it and to not take everything so seriously, which has helped me immensely, especially with things like especially when I'm thinking like very negatively of myself. He would ask me questions of like, if you had a friend, would you tell your friend what you're telling yourself? And I would say, absolutely not. And so thinking that way and thinking like how I need to talk to myself, how I would talk to a friend. Like I was going to tell my friend, like, you look terrible today, or you look anxious, or you look awful. I would never do that. So I shouldn't talk to myself that way. And I continuously remind myself to think that way. So it's kind of almost like rewiring how you're thinking into actually thinking and why you're thinking these ways, and to just label it. And it's been really, really helpful.
And how long have you been journaling?
I've been journaling off and on actually since I was like 9 years old. I don't do it as regularly as I should, but it is really, really helpful just to write out everything you're feeling and all of your thoughts. I feel like I hold a lot of like anger and emotion in my body. And when I write everything out, it just goes into that. And I feel so much better afterwards. And it's something that I really need to continuously do, because I've been slacking on that part.
Wonderful, wonderful. So great that you've managed to find all of these different mechanisms to help you on your journey. Could you talk about your day-to-day? How has your life been impacted by mental health, asthma, have you had to make accommodations or changes? And how has it impacted maybe your relationships with others?
Yeah, so it's definitely affected my life a lot. My day-to-day is I do take a lot of medications. I have a 7-day thing for AM and a 7-day like pill pack for the PM, where I take my medications every single morning. And then I take all my PM medications at night, which includes all of my things for anxiety, depression, ADHD, and asthma. I take 2 inhalers daily for asthma. One is a steroid inhaler, one is an inhaler that kind of helps the other inhaler out, and then I take albuterol as needed. Anytime I get sick, I use my nebulizer, which is kind of like a breathing type machine that I just breathe through and hook it up to, and use albuterol in that. And when I'm really sick, I have to do that every 4 hours. So I can't really always go out with friends. And when I get sick, I get deathly sick. And I usually get sick for a couple of weeks. So I can't really hang out with friends all the time, even though people ask me to hang out, and I feel really guilty about that. And when I do push myself, a lot of times I just get sicker and worse. Another thing that's really been hard is alcohol, because I'm not supposed to mix alcohol with my medications. So I'm allowed to have 1 or 2 drinks, maybe once every 2 weeks or so. So I can't really go out drinking with my friends, which has been really tough. It's nice to be able to hang out with people and not have to worry about anything. But I always have to keep in mind, I need to remember to take my medication in the morning, and I have to take my medication at night. So that's been a thing that I've been working on my entire life to figure out, because over the years, depression's gotten worse, anxiety's gotten worse. I've been put on new medications and more, and I do take a lot of medications. So that part has been really rough and hard to deal with. And I've dated people who are not really happy that I'm on so many medications. They're like, you don't need to be on all this. And I get comments at doctor's offices. If I ever go to urgent care or a new doctor, I always get asked all these questions of why are you on so many medications? And I'm like, they help me. They literally, that's how I can function. I'm like, when I'm not on medications, I cannot function as a normal human being. I wouldn't be able to do anything that I can do today. Whereas now I'm on a stable dose of medications that helps me so much, where I can function on a day-to-day basis and actually be helpful and be able to do things.
And the process of finding medications that help you is a long one in and of itself. What were medications that you tried that just absolutely didn't work or caused such severe side effects that you didn't want to continue with them?
Yep. So the main one was Lexapro. Lexapro is the worst medication I was ever put on. I was put on that to deal with panic attacks and severe anxiety. And at first it helped a lot, but then my thoughts would be racing 24/7 and I couldn't remember things. I am a zookeeper and I need to be able to remember everything at my job, and I would forget things all the time, and I would be very forgetful. My thoughts would always be racing, and I wouldn't be able to hear people's conversations, and I would almost disassociate from them. So I just felt like I was outside of my body looking in on a conversation, but I wasn't really part of that conversation. I hated that drug. That was the one that had the worst side effects for me. Other drugs I was on, Prozac caused me to have trembling hands. So now my hands constantly tremble. I'm no longer on Prozac, but my hands still shake all the time. So I have very shaky hands. And I was on a lot of medications that just did not work, but it was definitely a long process to figure out what would work for me without feeling like a zombie. I was on also a medication known as Lamictal, which is a mood stabilizer. And I felt like I had no emotions. I just felt apathetic. I didn't have any emotions. I had no joy. I had no sadness. I just had numbness and apathy. And that was really tough. So I was not on that medication anymore either.
So the Prozac was helping you, and what made you stop? Was it the handshaking, or was it something else?
It started with the trembles in the hands. And then I saw the psychiatrist that my parents saw, and he wanted to put me on a medication since at that time, I think I was around 16, 17. They wanted to try me on Klonopin, because that's what my mom, my dad, and my other relatives take for anxiety. My anxiety had gotten worse, even though I was on Prozac. My anxiety kind of came back. So they had put me on Klonopin to help with that, and then they put me on Wellbutrin to help with my depression.
And so fast forward many years, right? You found things that allow you or enable you to live better. What are those things that are helping you most these days?
So like my medications, what medications I'm on. So right now I have a whole like list in my phone that I always bring out to like doctors anytime I go to a new doctor. I take Klonopin, I take Adderall, I take Seroquel, and I take Doxepin. And those are all the ones for my mental health issues. For my asthma, I take Symbicort, and I take the highest dose. And then with that, I take Spiriva. So I have 2 puffs in the morning, 2 puffs at night, and then 1 puff of the Spiriva morning, 1 puff at night. And for medications at nighttime, I take Doxepin and Seroquel, half a Klonopin. In the mornings, I take Klonopin and Adderall.
And with those medications, with the CBT, you're able to manage through. Zookeeping sounds like such a fun job. I probably spend the whole day talking about that job, and I'm sure it's just, I imagine it's fun, but maybe that's just a perception. Talk about your relationships and how are they these days?
I like my relationships with people. So they're good. I've always been a person who's been like a huge advocate for like mental health, and for the longest time in my life, I just didn't care what other people said. When people were like, you're on so many medications, or like, you have all these disorders, guys I've dated that just like would put those things down. I would stand up for myself and be like, if I didn't have these, I could not function. That's just who I am. So I was kind of like, I was an advocate for it. I felt like it was very important to like talk about it with especially partners and friends that I felt comfortable with, and tell them about like my issues and why I'm on so many medications and why this helps me and what would happen if I was not on these medications. So I definitely struggled through the years with relationships. I was in a very abusive relationship where I was really dumb and I went off all of my medications, and I had a plan to kill myself, and I ended up in a mental hospital for a week. And I kept still trying to contact this guy because I was in this weird relationship where I just couldn't get away. Even when I tried to get away, it was really difficult. But going off all those medications, I got so sick, and I just couldn't function, and I just wasn't doing well at all. So then I moved back home from college, and I went back to my psychiatrist, and I went back to therapy and got back to like where I needed to be. And that's around the time I met my husband, who is accepting of all those things. He's wonderful. He accepts all of my medications. He never wants to change me or anything like that. Where in the past I had a boyfriend, he played guitar and he would play this song for me. He'd be like, you're perfect. The song would go something like, you're perfect, even, especially since you're on all these medications, and if you like, you don't need to be on these medications. Essentially, the song was about. And that was like his song for me, and I didn't like that because I felt like he didn't support who I was, and he didn't support my mental health, and didn't really understand. Whereas my husband, he supports all the medications I'm on. He supports therapy. He supports me going to a psychiatrist, and is very supportive, which has been wonderful. With friends, it's been difficult because I'll get into very like depressive slumps where I just don't want to talk to people for weeks. So I lost a lot of friends that way. I pushed people away. I never liked people to get too close, probably from like abandonment issues as a child. So I would usually pull away from friends, and I would make plans with people, and then I would always cancel them last minute. Like I was that person, and I hated to be that person, but like my anxiety would get too bad or my depression would get too bad, and I just couldn't deal with it, and I needed time for myself, and I never gave enough time for myself. And now I know that I deserve time for just myself to do what I need to do to kind of just mentally get back to where I want to be.
I reflect on your journey and finding the person who can support you and accept what you need to do to take care of yourself. That's a wonderful thing. And the sentiment came through very clearly. So your husband sounds like a wonderful guy. So thank you so much. You've shared so much, from your mental health through to the asthma. It sounds like you're in a good spot today, but it also sounds like it's a continuous journey. Mm-hmm. Meaning every day you have to ensure that you are taking care of yourself, as well as taking the medication and doing many other things, the CBT, the journaling, to ensure that you are able to be the best you can be. And that's part of all of our journeys. It's continuous. So this is the moment where I ask, and I recognize we've gotten over time, so if you have to run, just let me know as well. But I'd like to ask sort of, what advice do you have, for the little girls who go through very difficult times, as you have, what would you tell them? And then for those who, think they have bronchitis every couple of months, what do you share with them to help them either get to a good place faster or power through?
So for little girls, I would want to say that if you're struggling mentally, that there's help out there, and that getting that help is going to be so beneficial for you. It's going to make you feel so much better. And I know sometimes it's really hard to ask for help, especially if you've been on your own so much. But when you get that help of therapy, it just changes your entire life. I went to a group called Alateen, which is for kids with alcoholic parents. And through all those kids, we would kind of get together, just like kind of AA meetings. We would get together and talk about our relatives with alcohol that we deal with. And a lot of those people fell into being alcoholics themselves. They fell into heroin. They fell into much harder drugs. And those are the people who did not go to therapy. I was one of the few people who did go to therapy and who did not end up like that. And I feel really bad because all these people had so much potential. One of my best friends in middle school and high school, she was so intelligent. Her dad was a severe alcoholic and he didn't get help, and she never got help either. And now she's been in and out of jail for heroin use, which is terrible. And then a lot of the people I know that were in Alateen, they just didn't do well. They followed the footsteps of their parents instead of like learning from their mistakes, which I don't blame them for. But I feel like going to therapy is just so essential. And now it's more accessible. Back when I was a kid, it wasn't very accessible. I was very lucky. I was a privileged person who was my parents were able to afford therapy back then. But now it's so much more accessible. So I would feel like reaching out to therapy, or if you are a child of an alcoholic parent, to go to Alateen and talk to people who have the same experience as you, makes you feel so much less alone. And taking medications is not a bad thing. If you need it to function in life, that's okay. If you have, chemicals in your brain that are not balanced, that's not your problem. That's not your fault. But these medications, they balance out those chemicals in your brain. They make you be able to function. So that's very important. And for people who have bronchitis all the time and are constantly struggling, and they're wondering why they're getting it all the time, I would suggest that they would go to a pulmonologist and get tested for asthma. I was not very knowledgeable on what asthma actually was, and I didn't know what the feelings were of asthma, and I felt like I was never really educated there. So if I was getting sick all the time, I think people should continue to fight and go to doctors to figure out what is wrong, get to the root of that problem. I feel like that's very, very important.
Absolutely. That's wonderful advice. Well, Lauren, thank you so much. You've shared quite a bit. Your journey, your advice. I am absolutely certain it's going to help someone who is struggling and wants to find a solution for themselves, because for whatever reason, you're not given the playbook for life. You're not given, this is what you do when you experience this. And even just the notion that, as you said in the beginning of this conversation, knowing that you're not alone is such a powerful thing. So wanted to thank you so much for taking the time today to share your journey with us. Thank you again for sharing.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Take care and enjoy the day. And let's stay in touch. Thank you.
All right. Sounds good. Bye.
Bye-bye.